Written by PhantomPen. What's the longest length of time you've ever looked into a mirror? It's not something we usually think about. It's normal, we see them every day more often than we realize. We wake up, see ourselves in the bathroom mirror, drive to work looking in the rearview mirrors. We pass windows, polished surfaces, see our faces in the black screens of computers and televisions. The end result is that we have a very strong sense of ourselves, what we look like, how we act. Mirrors aren't luxury items anymore, but long ago they weren't as common, and a lot of work might have gone into a special mirror. They were heirlooms, symbols of status as well as tools for everyday life. The mirror my grandparents owned was one such example. It was taller than a man and immensely heavy, beautifully adorned in styled brass that wrapped around the thick glass. It was ancient, and its origins had been lost to time, besides that it had been passed down from generation to generation, unfortunately skipping my father's generation due to his and my mother's untimely passing. And so I came to know the mirror itself in the few months I lived with my grandparents before I left for university. It was well suited to my grandparents' ancient single-story home. My grandmother would fuss in front of it before church every Sunday. It was always there in the main living room, occupying its own corner like a small shrine, partially sunken into the wooden floorboards. When my grandparents passed as well, within the same year of each other, I came back to the house and everything else I inherited. I had only just graduated and now had lost the last of my family. Simply being in the house brought back a flood of happy memories of my family, and as such I was deep in grief for a long while, but it was still better than being anywhere else. I lived there for the time being, telling myself I would take time to go through my grandparents' belongings and sort any remaining affairs before likely leaving to find a job in my field. After a month, the grief didn't fully dissipate, but it became more of a background noise to the daily comings and goings of life. Such is the nature of grief. My grandparents hadn't had much money to leave me, but I was comfortable for the time being. Still, there was a massive amount of old things crammed into the old home, and I had thought of at least getting some of them appraised. The mirror was chief amongst the items on my list, but I realized I couldn't move it. While I had always known it was incredibly heavy as a child, now that I was a grown man and unable to even budge it the slightest bit, the weight of it seemed impossible. I could feel more movement against the brick wall than against the mirror. It seemed almost to be locked solidly in the space it occupied. The more I fussed with it, trying to move it, polish it, or see any kind of maker stamp or engraving, the more I began to wonder about the mirror. I had never seen my grandparents clean it, yet it was impossibly polished and unmarred. Even trying to mark it on purpose seemed to do nothing. Oppositely, the brass that held the massive mirror had long lost its luster, but was impossibly resistant to any of my attempts to clean or polish it. I could not mark any part of the mirror or brass. Even trying to scratch the tiniest pieces with my fingernail was fruitless. Deeper part of me knew that had I tried to damage it in earnest with a nail or hammer, it would fail. Unnatural. That was the feeling that the mirror permeated, and now that I was aware of it, I couldn't help but regard the mirror any time I was in the living room, or passing by it when I left the house. In fact, it was on one such morning as I passed the door that I first noticed something wrong. I had simply been on my way to get a coffee, a daily routine just to get me out of the house, and as always, out of the corner of my eye, I minded the mirror as I left. It took until I had actually walked out of the house and closed the door for me to process what I had seen. I had been facing myself, or rather my reflection had been standing, facing me as I left. Understand, my reflection should have been mimicking me, closing the door in pantomime as I did, but it hadn't. Out of the corner of my eye, I had seen it simply standing there as I left. I paused a moment and reopened the door, peeking my head back inside. I saw the mirror and my reflection, head poked just inside past the door as well. I reclosed and locked the door. I was tired, and perhaps the grief and stress had been taking its toll on me. Things continued normally for another few weeks until, again, as I was walking into the kitchen from the living room, I felt something slightly off. It was the mirror, or rather my reflection. It hadn't turned when I went into the kitchen. I was sure of it. But when I turned around sharply, it was there. The same worried look on its face as mine. This happened several more times over the course of a week. It would be simple things. The reflection would be slightly out of sync when I stood up, being a split second late, or it would be standing still when I walked into the room when it should be mid-stride. Instead of watching it from the corner of my eye, I began purposely avoiding seeing it. And finally, one night, as I picked up an empty glass to bring to the kitchen before retiring to bed, I watched, blood running cold, as my reflection carried the glass in the wrong hand, mimicking me as I carried the glass to the kitchen. After this, I immediately went and got an old sheet and threw it over the mirror, unable to meet the eyes of my own reflection. I'll admit I was scared. I slept uneasily. In the morning, I felt my heart skip a beat as I walked into the living room before remembering it was I who threw the sheet over the mirror. After that, life returned to normal for a week. Eventually, seeing the sheet-covered mirror in the living room every day, I began to feel silly. I was a grown man, afraid of my own reflection. I also began to wonder if I was actually going crazy from the stress and grief. With each passing day, the feelings grew, until I felt so sure that I must have been imagining things that I decided to remove the cloth from the mirror. But as I approached it, I hesitated. I looked around the room, mid-morning sunlight spilling through the large front window. The entire room unchanged since I was a child. It was that childish part of me that was still scared. And so, instead of pulling the sheet back all at once, I instead bent over and pulled the bottom part of the sheet up and looked into the mirror. I did not see my own face looking back at me. Instead, I saw my legs stock still, as if my reflection was simply standing behind the sheet waiting. And then, before my mind had chance to fully make sense of this, my reflection quickly bent down to match my pose. Its head darting down, head grasping where the sheet should have been, eyes looking into my own. I immediately dropped the sheet back down over the mirror and took several steps back. My heart pounded in my ears. There was no way I had imagined that. It was as if it was simply waiting for me, expecting my reflection to jump out at any moment from behind the cloth. I couldn't live like this. I spent the rest of the day out of the house, pacing the shopping mall, walking a nature trail nearby, trying to force my mind away from what I had seen. Towards evening, I had come up with a flimsy plan, and so I called friends of mine that I hadn't seen since graduation, and we spoke for a while, and I successfully invited them over to the house in 2 days' time to catch up. Until then, I had spent more time outside of the house than inside it, and the sheet remained draped over the mirror, undisturbed. The friends were a couple I had known for some years, and I was lucky they were willing to make the hour drive to see me. Minutes before they arrived, I steeled my nerves and in one great motion pulled the sheet off the mirror, revealing my own wild-eyed visage, sheet in hand, a perfect copy. I relaxed a bit. If I wasn't crazy, I had to have witnesses. I hefted the last of the stacked newspapers and boxes off of the small living room coffee table and was ready just as they knocked on the door. We exchanged greetings and hugs, and I showed them into the living room, and the afternoon began in earnest. Their visit was truly refreshing. At times I forgot about the mirror completely, and I eventually began to relax and enjoy the feeling of conversation I hadn't had in weeks. We talked of other friends, where they were, what they were doing, shared our own current endeavors, and although briefly we spoke of the old house and the mirror itself even earned a compliment. I tensed at this, but as we all looked into the mirror there was nothing unusual, just our own perfect reflections. I relaxed, and carried by this sudden positive feeling, I smiled and offered to refill my guests' drinks. As I walked back into the kitchen to fetch the open bottle of wine, I heard their question behind me. "Whoa, how did you do that?" I stopped, turning to them. Their eyes went from me to the mirror and back again. "How did I do what?" I asked. They paused, looking again to the mirror. One of them said slowly, "That's a pretty good trick." While my mind wheeled, I smiled. "With the mirror?" I asked. They nodded, now also smiling and laughing a bit. "It is, isn't it?" I replied, and calmly went back into the kitchen so they wouldn't notice my panic. I didn't know what it was, but they had seen something. I wasn't crazy, and the thought struck me that the alternative was far worse. I resisted the urge to throw the sheet back over the mirror, and I didn't press them on what they had seen. Thankfully, a storm was just beginning to darken the evening sky, and when the first drops of rain tapped on the glass of the living room window, my guests decided to make an early start back home. We said our goodbyes, promising to visit their home next time, and when the door closed and they walked away, my world returned to its previous state. I was alone. My fear of the mirror was well-founded, and I had no idea what to do now. I left the living room, going instead to my bed, but not sleeping. I simply listened to the thunderstorm outside. I couldn't leave the house to flee. I had nowhere to go. And so, eventually, I mustered what little courage I had and went back into the living room. The rain drummed against the window in waves, the clouded sky darkening the room even with the lights on. I stood in the entryway to the living room and looked at the mirror, seeing my reflection as normal. But something was off. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I approached the mirror, growing bolder in the absence of anything immediately wrong, and I examined myself. The reflection was perfectly normal again, but as I stood in front of the mirror, thinking and watching myself, I felt the urge to raise my hand. I was doing it before I even realized it, slowly raising my hand above my head. I didn't know why, but it just felt right. It felt like I had to do this. And then I noticed, in horror, my reflection already had its hand up, arm extended above its head, and it was now I who was slowly matching it. I shuddered, but couldn't stop raising my hand, and when I had done so, matching my reflection perfectly, it smiled at me. A sinister thing, lips peeled back in a huge grin as it looked at me. I struggled to breathe, and to my horror, I felt the edges of my mouth tug upwards, ever so slightly. And then everything went dark. The thunder was so loud I thought the window would shatter. I sucked in a deep breath, regaining control of myself. The power had gone out, and the room was nearly pitch dark. I turned from the mirror and went out of the room as fast as I could, tripping over the stacked papers and boxes or furniture, fumbling my way into the hallway, and eventually only relaxing when I felt my hands rest on my bed. My heart was pounding, my breathing heavy. I was terrified. How had that happened? What did it mean? In the dark, I replayed the events over and over in my mind for hours, trying to make sense of any part of it. The power had yet to come back on, but I felt like I could no longer sit still. I moved around the house, hand against the wall, fumbling through drawers and cabinets looking for a flashlight. Eventually, I found a set of old candles and matches. I lit one there in the kitchen, letting the poor, flickering light wash over the room. I sat there for a few minutes, watching the candle, again trying to piece together the day's events. And then I saw it. Flickering light was peeking out from around the corner of the kitchen. There was a light in the living room. Unthinking, I went to the corner, and when I looked into the room, I was met with the source of the light. My own reflection holding the same candle. That couldn't be right, but there was no other source I could see. Had it reflected me even when I was out of the room? I moved closer and a chill went up my spine. My reflection followed my movements, but almost reluctantly. It was slightly delayed, and some small, indiscernible something was wrong. Something as small as a crease around the eyes or a movement of the arm, but something made the reflection uncanny and strange as we approached each other. Eventually, I stood a meter from the mirror, and while I watched my reflection, I realized my reflection watched my candle. I moved the candle towards the mirror slightly, and my reflection followed suit, but there it was. Something in the way it looked. Uneasiness. It held the candle out slightly further from its body than I did. It disliked it. I pulled the candle close to me, and I could almost feel my reflection resist. It met my gaze, and I felt it again. A sudden, unshakable desire. I was going to extinguish the candle. It was making me do so. Instead, with every fiber of my being, I pulled the candle close to me and felt the flame lick the underside of my arm. I felt the pain and gritted my teeth. But in the mirror, my reflection screamed. I couldn't hear it, but I saw my face twist in pain, head back. I watched myself howl and scream as the flame burned me, and eventually, when it became too unbearable on my end, I pulled the candle away from my singed arm. Immediately, the reflection met my gaze, and I saw the fury in its eyes. I knew any pretense was gone now, and it knew it too. I felt my arm jerk away from me, and I immediately pulled the candle back towards me, but it fell from the sudden movement. It smoldered there in the carpet, but didn't go out. And when a small flame blossomed at our feet, I felt my body convulse. My reflection was moving madly, in sudden, jerking, inhuman-like movements. It kicked at the candle and scrambled back further into the room, seemingly pressing against the edges of what the mirror showed. I stood there, dumbstruck as reality split in two. At my feet, the candle burned a small flame on the carpet, but in the mirror, it had been kicked and rolled. I watched as the newspapers and boxes there caught fire. The reflection moved even faster, twisting, trying to put out each new flame as it took hold of a paper or box, and eventually other things began to catch. The reflection went around trying to smother several flames at once, picking things up, joints bending backwards unnaturally, all the while silently shrieking and moving. It couldn't leave, I realized. It couldn't move beyond the edges of the mirror as I was seeing it. I had unknowingly trapped it just by standing still and not running. However, the flame from my own dropped candle was starting to begin in earnest, already spreading around the edge of the wall along the carpet. Still, I remained frozen there, unwilling to move, watching my reflection panic. If I left now, what would happen? Would it escape? Could I risk it? I stood, rooted to the spot in front of the mirror as the fire spread around me. I would not move. Minutes passed, and the heat grew unbearable. I felt the fire around me, but I didn't look away from the mirror. Inside was an inferno, the reflections still moving around rapidly, unnervingly, and I continued to watch it. Eventually I had to crouch down, breathing the air closer to the floor, and now the reflection matched me. I saw my own cold face reflected, the grim determination in my eyes, and for the first time I realized I would likely die here. The smoke stung my eyes, but I still noticed it. The subtle change in the reflection, the anger that flashed across its face, and I remembered how it had smiled at me when I raised my arm earlier. I watched it through tearing eyes, sucked at the last of the remaining cool air by the floor, and made my resolve. I would watch it till the end. When I awoke, someone was propping my head up, and the oxygen from the mask they pressed against me suddenly filled my lungs. I coughed, blinking against the still pouring rain, saw the flashing lights, and as the pain washed over my body, I lost consciousness again. I was in the hospital for 3 days. I had been lucky, they told me, and though my leg had been badly burned, I could still walk. I would likely make a full recovery in time. The pain racked me with every step, but I assured them I was fine, and with only a crutch and medicine, I was discharged and made my way home. When I reached my grandparents' house, I realized just how lucky I had truly been. The house was a ruin. Even the roof had burned away. What hadn't burned away had collapsed. Still, the mirror weighed on my mind, and I forced myself through the rubble, stepping into the ruined living room. And there it was. It was still upright, but leaning to one side where the carpet and floorboards had burned away. It was black, where before no dirt ever seemed to cling to it. Now it was awash with soot from the fire. And yet as I approached it, ever so faintly, I thought I saw light coming through the grime. I took a deep breath and wiped away a patch of soot in front of me with my sleeve. It was my face. It had to be, but it was ruined, melted and burned, twisted and screaming. The reflection clawed madly at the glass between us, as if trying to get out or get to me. Its fingers were blackened bone. The flesh on its body, my body, was burned away and singed. Its eyes had melted away, but it scraped and clawed and screamed, teeth falling out from the skull from the effort where lips and gums had once been. An inferno of flames engulfing what was once the house. I recoiled from it, lashing out by instinct with my crutch just to push the thing away from me, and the mirror swayed. It tipped. The floorboards gave a final crack, and the massive mirror fell into the ruin. It cracked sharply, like lightning. The cracks spread in all directions, splintering the glass until the pieces themselves fell from the mirror, landing collectively in the ashes within a second of each other. I caught my breath. I prodded the ruined mirror with my crutch. The immense weight seemed to have vanished from it. Easily I turned it over, and there where the glass had once been, I saw the back of the mirror. It was covered in scratches, uneven and frantic, 5 across from fingernails. They seemed to rise away from where the scorch marks bled through, no doubt from where the fire had lapped at the back of the mirror. I bent to examine them, these impossible markings seemingly clawed into silver. and possibly on the inside of the mirror, between glass, and I pulled my hand away as I touched them. It was still hot, as if it had just been pulled from the flame. I kicked it with my good leg, and it easily broke, the long back of the mirror cracking softly. I bent and picked up the larger fragment of the glass mirror and looked into it. I held my breath. I saw myself, and for the faintest moment I felt panic. But then I recognized myself. I saw myself truly, my plain reflection, tired and burned, still in my hospital clothes. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was like a massive weight had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. I felt genuine happiness. It was finally over. For the first time in ages, I began to smile, my body tensing as I felt the edges of my mouth tug upwards, ever so slightly. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?